Okay, so thank you for those who I've not seen who've come along. It always upsets me sometimes when they come, we don't get vast crowds of people. I just think these talks are so important, and I wish more people would come. Please come in. So it's a delight to have Sam Adelman, well-established professor in environmental law, been studying the subject for a long time, has a mastery over the issues. Originally from South Africa, but now he's in University of Warwick, and he's a leading scholar in environmental law, international environmental law, but also climate justice issues and the interrelationship between environmental law and human rights. And he's tackling today a subject that, for some people, they think that this is a peripheral issue, but it's really on the horizon and is being put forward by many as a solution to climate change, and a real solution so that we don't go above 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and we meet the Paris Agreement targets. But the implications of it are phenomenal and really need to be understood within a legal framework. So Sam's going to talk about that, and he's got some large words up there. It's got the word chemistry, which frightens me. So yeah, I hand to Sam, and he'll be doing a talk for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. Okay.
Thanks, Freya. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to you for being here. Freya is correct. This is an important issue, and it's going to become increasingly important. An issue that we are going to have to address, and as you'll see, the arguments here are we need collective action, and the question is how we do that in transparent, accountable, and democratic ways. And my work in this area is very much in a spirit of inquiry. It's, how do we do this? We need to start having discussions amongst ourselves, and then hopefully getting this into broader public discourse. Actually, it's this presentation is based on an article with the title of the seminar that came out in the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment 8.1. If anybody wants to look at this in greater detail. I apologize in advance to people who may know quite a lot about geoengineering, but I can't assume that everybody does. So if you'll bear with me as I go through just outlining what the issues are. So, to summarize, in a sense, is Freya was talking about, the aim in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement to keep average global temperature from increasing by no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and preferably the exhortation to prevent temperature from rising by more than 1.5 degrees, which is what small island developing states threatened with inundation from rising sea levels actually need to survive. It's an existential question. So during the Paris negotiations, for example, they had a campaign, 1.5 to survive. And so the temperature is, would we trust anybody to have their finger on the global thermostat? Should anybody? Because as I go through this, the questions that will arise is whether we should permit geoengineering And if so, is it possible to regulate it? How relevant is the law? How useful is the law in relation to an issue like geoengineering? So, let's start with the volcanoes. In 1991, as you see, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted, and global temperature was reduced by 0.5 degrees Celsius for a time. Now, since the Industrial Revolution, temperatures have increased by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. So we're already very, very close to the 1.5 degree target in Article 2, and halfway towards breaching the 2 degree Celsius target. And the volcanoes are relevant because what scientists are attempting to do with one strand of geoengineering is to mimic what volcanoes do. And you can see there that David Keith is the well-known Harvard scientist who is presiding over this project. You'll see this was March 2017, a $20 million project to send aerosol injections up into the stratosphere in the biggest chemtrails experiment to date. Now, what we know from previous volcanic eruptions is that in addition to decreasing temperature by putting this kind of duvet effect, preventing the heat from reaching the surface of the planet, they also have decreased rainfall, precipitation in many parts of the world. And this is relevant because if the geoengineering takes place and reduces the precipitation, if, for example, it disrupts the monsoon in South Asia, you're talking about 1.5 billion people's food and water security being threatened. So it's potentially very, very serious indeed. And the solar radiation management, which I'll come to in a moment, works by spraying sulfates into the atmosphere. And we also know that sulfur dioxide depletes the ozone layer. So there's another potential problem that arises. Now, there are two main types of geoengineering. The first one, carbon dioxide removal, is relatively benign. And I'll go through the pros and cons of both of these two main types. The problematic one is solar radiation management. Now, with carbon dioxide removal or carbon sequestration, you probably know it, you've probably heard of carbon capture and storage, which is, as you see, a technique for the long-term storage of carbon dioxide. So we might find the disused oil wells in the North Sea to be a good place to store the carbon dioxide, or in some kind of climate or poetic justice, the coal mines, the pits that have been closed, the coal being the dirtiest of the three fossil fuels, they might be good places to store carbon dioxide in future. And now this takes place, carbon sequestration takes place in plants and the soil as a natural process. And of course, the most important carbon sinks are the tropical forests, which we absolutely have to protect for human survival because of the absorption of carbon dioxide. There is also carbon sequestration underground in the geology, in the Earth's geology. It happens deep in the ocean, and this is where the research in carbon capture and storage is going as a solid material. Now, the idea, for example, is to capture the carbon dioxide as it's emitted in industrial processes. turn it into a solid, and bury it. So with terrestrial carbon sequestration, the carbon dioxide is absorbed naturally through photosynthesis and stored as carbon in biomass and soil. Now, in relation to forests, tropical deforestation is responsible for 20% of annual global carbon dioxide emissions. And an area the size of Wales is disappearing from the Amazon every year. And under Lula and then Dilma Rousseff's governments in Brazil, there was some progress being made that's now going into quite a big reverse. There are massive problems with the annual burning off of crops and cutting down of forests in Indonesia, in Asia. And it's imperative that we try to preserve them. There is the REDD+ framework for reducing forest degradation and deforestation that perhaps we could chat about after I finish speaking, and whether that is likely to succeed, because it basically involves commodifying forests. We're sadly at the point where the solution to climate change seems to be to turn nature into a range of commodities, because in a neoliberal world, we don't seem to have conversations that don't involve price, or not many. With the geological sequestration, you get the storing of carbon dioxide underground in rock formations over a long period of time. And the carbon dioxide is held in small pore spaces that have held oil and natural gas for millions of years. Now, here we're sort of like laugh I nearly cried bit. Some of the ideas that have been put forward for the geoengineering technologies. So you'll see, for example, climate-ready crops, artificial trees. And I really, really do not understand why, when trees are so efficient at absorbing carbon dioxide, we would want to invent artificial trees. Biochar, burning and then burying agricultural carbon waste underground. There's things like enhanced weathering, where because the carbon dioxide gets absorbed in the rocks geologically, and you can enhance that process. But there are things there you see, like white painting. So presumably we're going to have to paint every roof in the world white to reflect as much sunshine as possible, which is obviously much more sensible than reducing the use of fossil fuels. Space mirrors. Firing trillions of tiny aluminium mirrors into space to deflect sunlight. Do you think, when the people sat down in a room and came up with this idea, what were they actually smoking? Because what would be the carbon footprint of sending millions of mirrors into space? Cloud seeding. Again, if we could spray seawater into clouds to precipitate rain, fine. But two of the areas of climate science that are least understood to date, or relatively less understood, are ocean warming and cloud formation. So there's uncertainty, as there is intrinsic uncertainty in all climate science, but those are two areas. Certainly cloud formation is a potential problem. So here are some of the other, as I say, brave, brilliant, bizarre, benign, or just bonkers. Wrap Greenlandic, these are serious. I'm not making this stuff up. These are serious things. Greenland is the largest island in the world. So wrapping it in a blanket sounds wildly impractical, but that is exactly what Dr. Jason Box, a glaciologist from Ohio State University, proposes to do. He believes that if the world covers the country's glaciers with blankets, this will be enough to reflect the sun's rays and prevent the ice caps from melting. About 2 years ago, NASA and Bill Gates teamed up to hatch plans for a seawater spraying machine that could prevent climate change by creating clouds that reflect sunlight away from Earth. The machines could suck up 10 tons of water per second and then spray it over 3,000 feet into the air, increasing the density of clouds. Although the plan would help to mitigate climate change, it would take a large amount of energy to power each individual ship. And a study showed that it would take at least 1,900 ships at a cost of over $7 billion to stop the Earth's temperature from rising. And the list wouldn't be complete as the one I've referred to before, giving the Earth a solar shield. This is the idea of someone called Roger Angel. And according to his plan, there would be the construction of a massive 100,000 square mile solar shield made from trillions of lenses. This would help to deflect the sun's rays by 2% and keep the Earth cooler. The catch is that since it takes years, or did, to plan a shuttle mission, this project is practically impossible, and it would cost, the estimate when people sort of ran the figures, $350 trillion, 12 times global economic output annual, and of course its carbon footprint would be insane. So, in relation to carbon dioxide removal, the pros are, and this is an important one, it's relatively safe. Okay? The risks of capturing and storing carbon dioxide appear to be relatively low, and it is relatively cheaper than solar radiation management techniques, which I'll come to in a moment. The cons are that it's unproven, underdeveloped, and it will take many, many years to deploy at scale. This would have to be rolled, first of all, it would have to be proved to be effective, and then rolled out across the world. And from my research into this, we don't have the time that it would take. We're running out of time to meet the 2 degrees. I don't think there's any chance of not reaching the 1.5 degree Celsius goal in the Paris Agreement. We're running out of time with 2 degrees, and I can't see that carbon capture and storage at its current state of development would work in sufficient time. So here are some of the basic ideas of involved in carbon capture and storage. With the conventional one, the fossil fuel goes into the factory and comes out as carbon dioxide. With carbon capture and storage, a majority of the carbon dioxide is stored, and so you get a reduction in emissions. With biomass energy, you get a closed cycle where the biomass goes into the industrial process, comes out as carbon dioxide, which is then reabsorbed by the trees. And then the final one, where you do have this one would give you 0 emissions with BECCS, with biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. You would have negative emissions, so it would actually be reducing the amount of emissions. And again, so that would be very virtuous if it can be done. So at the risk of some kind of repetition, the idea of artificial trees, also the idea of fertilizing the ocean, this has happened. It's illegal, as far as I'm aware, but a Canadian called Russ George, I think, tried to do something of this kind in about 2010 or somewhere around there, until he was stopped by the Canadian government. There are other ideas to try and get more algae to bloom in the ocean, because algae will suck up carbon dioxide. And of course the idea of chimney filters that I've mentioned before. So that's, as I say, relatively safe and relatively cheap are the virtues of carbon dioxide removal. The problem area is solar radiation management. So albedo modification is cloud modification, as I say, using the Pinot-Tube effect of mimicking volcanoes. And you can see from the diagram there that you have the injection of aerosols into the upper atmosphere to increase the scattering of sunlight, causing less sunlight to reach the surface. And secondly, increasing the reflectivity of low clouds to cool the planet. So is it feasible? Can it be done? The problems at the outset are that, well, depending on which scheme is being proposed, it may or may not be less costly than carbon dioxide removal. It is definitely more risky, and I'll go through some of the risks. The big issue here, well, there are two issues from a legal and a political and a democratic perspective. The first is research. The second is deployment. And decisions have to be made. Well, the research is going ahead. Should we, could we, would we want to ban research into solar radiation management techniques that are thought to be risky? Could we possibly do it? I was just having a conversation earlier on about, for example, yesterday, the news that 2 macaques have been cloned in China. And so we know that because the scientists doing the work are revealing what they're doing. But we can't be sure about what research is being done in which institutions, in which countries. So even if we wanted to ban research, would it be possible using the law? Isn't it better to try and get as much transparency as possible, so at least we know who's trying to do what? So the research is one thing. We can come back and talk about it. The second is deployment. Now, the problem with solar radiation management is that if it's done at a scale that is necessary to find out whether it will work, and it has unintended consequences, it creates risks, would we be able to recall it? And if we couldn't, what should we do? Should we ban deployment? Could we ban deployment? So a lot of the research is being done through modeling because of the problems inherent in deploying at scale. Now, some of the consequences of injecting sulfates into the stratosphere are that we might have permanent clouds. I say to my students, would you like your children to grow up? The sky might turn orange. The sky wouldn't be blue. We'd have next generations growing up without knowing blue skies. So, when I talk about, the price of everything and the value of nothing, what price do we put, or what value should we put on blue skies, or saving polar bears, or any of the kinds of, on forests as for their intrinsic value rather than their economic value? We'd have to have, according to some of the research, as I said, a permanent flotilla of ships up to 2,000, or a fleet of balloons permanently above the earth that were spraying the sulfates. The big problem is, potentially, if we start, we might not be able to stop. So, let's assume that one or more of these technologies works. If we start spraying sulfates into the atmosphere, and it does work, and it reduces the temperature, we would have to keep doing it forever. Because if we stop doing it, the temperature would just spiral completely out of control. And again, we're not sure in terms of climate science already whether we're at or past tipping points, negative feedback loops, because again, we've never been here before. Never have human beings conducted an experiment like climate change on the planet. So we'd have no way of measuring what we're doing now against something before, because we've never been here before. So if suddenly it stopped being done, the temperature might go up like 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius. So it would have to be permanent. And as I said, some of the side effects, potential side effects, would be affecting precipitation, such as the South Asian monsoon. We're already seeing massive, massive forest fires. So in California, in the Napa Valley, in wine country in California, huge, huge forest fires on a regular basis. There is, I was saying to Faye, there is a group of Portuguese youths who are crowdfunding climate litigation against the Portuguese government for failing to put into place policies that are preventing the annual savage forest fires in Portugal. So this is already happening. These are manifestations of what's already happening. It could get worse. If the precipitation is undermined, it could intensify the droughts. Now, again, we're just talking about, I don't know if you know what's happening in Cape Town. Now, Cape Town is running out of water. That area of South Africa is experiencing the biggest drought since records began. And by April the 12th, they're going to be standpipes. And it's not going to stop. There's a drought been going on for 2 years now. There's desertification desertification is taking place in sub-Saharan Africa as the Sahara creeps southwards. It's taking place in the southwest of the United States. Arizona, New Mexico, parts of California are turning into desert. In Australia, And so the danger is we can see what's happening already with about 1.1 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. These are some of the potential risks of solar radiation management that could intensify these risks. So you can see here some of the pros and cons. With carbon dioxide removal, it actually addresses the cause. The cause of the climate change is primarily carbon dioxide. There are several other greenhouse gases. But so we're trying to deal with carbon dioxide. Whereas with the solar radiation management, it doesn't address the problem. It's trying to mitigate the problem without necessarily reducing the use of, or the emission of carbon dioxide. In fact, one of the big risks of geoengineering is that people look at it and say, well, we've got a get out of jail card. We can carry on merrily using fossil fuels as much as we want. So we can go, and as far as the Russians and others around the Arctic are concerned, there is this virtuous circle where climate change leads to the melting of the Arctic ice, which makes it possible to get the oil and gas that's under the Arctic and burn it, intensifying the problem. So people are advocating, certainly, the fossil fuel companies, geoengineering to enable them to continue profiting from the extraction of fossil fuels. Things are changing because now New York has threatened to a case against fossil fuel companies. There is a case being brought in California. A couple of municipalities in California are bringing a case against energy companies for rising sea levels on the California coast. So gradually there is an extended amount that climate litigation is now taking off in quite a big way. And James Hansen, the NASA scientist who sort of first alerted the US government in about 1987 to the true scale of what was going on, has now called for a massive wave of climate litigation because he thinks, with a great deal of justification, sad to say, that the Paris Agreement, well, his term is bullshit. He just thinks it's not got enough teeth. It may be legally binding, but it's not enforceable, as we can see with the Trump administration threatening to pull out. And with the climate litigation, it seems to me there are two main forms. One is against states, such as against the Portuguese government for the forest fires, etc. The other now, increasingly, there are attempts to do to the energy companies what happened with the tobacco companies. Again, it took a long, long time to deal with the tobacco companies. And in many cases, they've just shifted now to the global south, where the rules on smoking, etc., are not as strong as they are elsewhere. And we're running out of time there again. So to go back here, so the carbon dioxide proposals, there are no great new global risks, whereas with SRM, there certainly are. The carbon dioxide removal are expensive, or currently expensive, or expensive comparable to the cost of emissions reduction, whereas the SRM techniques are said to be relatively inexpensive. Carbon dioxide removal may produce only modest effects within decades, whereas solar radiation management can produce quite substantial effects if the technologies work within a much shorter time. So far as law and politics are concerned, carbon dioxide removal raises fewer and less difficult issues with global governance, in stark contrast to solar radiation management. Carbon dioxide removal would be judged largely on cost, whereas solar radiation management needs to be addressed in terms of risk. So those are, without going through all of them, those are some of the comparisons that are salient. So what are the ethical issues involved here? Well, there's the moral hazard, as I said. Will climate engineering reduce incentives to mitigate? So people say we don't have to worry about keeping temperature from increasing by more than 2 degrees Celsius because we've got a technology. And it's kind of, there's a kind of technology fetishism operating here where, it's the boys with toys. And a lot of it is actually, it's very male dominated. There's a kind of male geo clique pretty much in Europe and North America who are making these proposals. And many of them, I referred to the Harvard experiment earlier on, many of them have got patents on the technology. So they're hoping to get very rich by saving the world. Is solar radiation management a slippery slope? Is the research and insurance policy to come back to the question of whether we should allow it or not? Given where we are, and given the intensifying climate harms that we see all around us, on a daily basis now, it's not as though, it used to be said climate change was a kind of invisible problem. It's not invisible. If you can't see climate change, it's because you're not looking. It's not, watching the news or reading newspapers or whatever it is. So would it be a dereliction of duty or violation of moral obligations not to undertake the research? Shouldn't we have an insurance policy in our back pocket? But that then creates the problem that Einstein foresaw with nuclear weapons. If you make them, someone will use them. And we see, again, it's a toss-up. Again, you were saying the doomsday clock has now been shifted to 2 minutes to midnight for 2 reasons. The threat of nuclear war with Kim Jong-un and that bastard in the White House, and climate change. So if the research has taken place, was the fact that it's taken place kind of force our collective hand? And every time I do this, I put the "our" in inverted commas because a good friend, Anna Greer, who's actually the editor of the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment, insists all the time that when we're talking about the we, who is the we is responsible for climate change? And again, historically, it's been Western white men who historically, since the Industrial Revolution, have been responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions. People in the global south have been responsible for very few. So who is the we? When people talk about the Anthropocene, so that we have become a telluric agent, we are now capable. We have changed the geology of the planet through things like plastics, concrete, radionuclides, traces of that in the geology, and of course the effects of climate change. But who is the we who is responsible for having done that? And of course, who should decide? So could we be confident that someone like Trump wouldn't authorize an experiment? Because America first is the withdrawal of multilateralism, the destruction for all its many problems of the liberal international order. You can foresee a situation saying, hey, the southwest of the United States is turning into a desert. We need to do something. Mexico wouldn't have a say. Nobody, potentially anybody else might have a say. And so going back to that question of whose hand, if anybody, should be on the global thermostat. To what extent will human rights be undermined? Will climate engineering further undermine human rights? Because we're talking about a very wide range of human rights that are already threatened. Livelihoods, food security, water security, the right to life itself. I mean, people are dying in the Caribbean and elsewhere from climate change. Climate change is violating human rights. And so my perspective on this is to say, should we risk finding out? And the other side of it is, can we risk not finding out? Now, I'm still sort of hoping against hope that we can do this through mitigation. But I think the pressures are going to increase quite substantially to permit geoengineering. Now, there was a project that took place in this country in May 2012 called the SPICE project. The experiment would have injected 150 liters of water into the atmosphere from a weather balloon via a 1 kilometer pipe tethered to a ship as part of the stratospheric particle injection for climate engineering, SPICE. Now, this would have been small, relatively low risk, and certainly nowhere near, that's the point I made before, nowhere near the scale where it would be an unacceptable level of risk. The two scientists involved in the project had not been initially forthcoming about the fact that they had submitted patents for the technology similar to that which they wanted to use in the SPICE project. And when the news came out in the media, there was a public outcry and they withdrew it. And what's interesting about that is that there was this kind of immediate and quite substantial public reaction saying, no, we don't like this. It's like, you know, debates about genetically modified crops, etc., those kind of things, about all the things, you know, that we're going to have such fun with when we get this massive trade deal with the United States and get chlorinated chicken and beef hormones and all the stuff that the European Union, terrible place that the European Union, has resisted in sort of environmental and risk and health terms. But it was, as I say, if the SPICE project was anything to go by, there was a great deal of unhappiness. Whether that will continue as the impacts of climate change unfold further, we will have to wait and see. This is, it was American businessman, Russ George, dumped 100 tons of iron sulfate into the Pacific as part of a scheme off the west coast of Canada. And this is where the law comes in. This violates the Convention on Biodiversity and the London Convention on the Dumping of Wastes at Sea, which place moratoria on profit-seeking ocean fertilization activities. Okay, so these are quite specific in relation to the oceans. They don't govern the atmosphere. There is no international law on experimenting with the atmosphere in this way. Now, the international environmental law principles that do exist, such as the no harm principle, one of the main problems with international environmental law is that it's very soft law. So one would think that a principle like the no harm principle that should prevent, harming the environment of other countries would apply. Whether the precautionary principle, I mean, you would think that this is the most perfect area for the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle basically says that if there is a risk that a certain activity will cause harm, that the onus is on the person or group of people who want to engage in that activity to show that it is safe. So again, you would think, perfect. Could we use it? Well, I don't know. Just to go back to the precautionary principle, if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, in the absence of scientific consensus that the action or policy is not harmful, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking the action. Now, ENMOD is the Environmental Modification Convention, formerly the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. It's a treaty that prohibits military or other hostile use of environmental modification techniques having widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. But of course, the proponents of geoengineering are going to argue that this is not hostile or for military use. So in terms of governance, assuming, as I do, that we require governance of geoengineering, what's the best level to do it? Where should it be done? Should it be done at a national level? Should individual countries take steps to regulate these techniques? And part of the problem with trying to regulate them is, I started out by saying there are two kinds, but within solar radiation management, there are a whole range of technologies. Would a piece of legislation be able to encompass all those technologies, or would you have to regulate all of them separately? Should it be done at regional level, for example, through the EU, or international? Should there be a dedicated treaty, or should this be done under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? I mentioned the Aarhus Convention, which is a convention on procedural justice in environmental issues, in which countries are required to provide adequate consultation and participation for the public on environmental issues. Perhaps the most well-known attempt to address this are the so-called Oxford Principles. There are 5 of them. They looked at governance, they looked at regulation, and came up with these 5. First of all, it should be regulated as a public good, as something that affects the public. It's not a private thing, it's a public. There must be public participation in decision making. There must be disclosure of research and open publication of results, because that's what we rely on with biotechnology, with all kinds of science. We rely on the scientific community to do this. There must be independent assessment of the impacts. And finally, there should be governance before deployment. Now, when this came up in the House of Commons, there was a parliamentary subcommittee, I think, who decided that Britain should not outlaw research on geoengineering because the UK can't know what other countries are doing, and it might put the country at a disadvantage. There's the danger, despite what they will say that this is not hostile, there is a danger of weaponizing the climate. And because the potential risks can't be contained within borders, we're talking about threats to other countries. we're already seeing the massive securitization of climate change. It's now coming way up the agenda. All the spooks, the CIAs and the GCHQs and all the risk assessments, climate change now is a massive security. It's being treated as a security risk. If deployment takes place that can't be recalled and has unintended effects, it could lead to massive migration that's making what's happening in the Mediterranean now. All the predictions of climate change, we're talking about predictions ranging from like 50 million to 200 million people, and that's going to lead to conflict. Already, climate change was an issue at the start of the Syrian war, it was an issue in Darfur, and potentially this will get worse. So we can engineer the climate, or we think we can certainly do it in terms of carbon capture and storage. But as I say, should we, and who are the we? So we're having people looking to technology to help us out of the mess that technology has gotten us into. Now, you know, there's potentially a lot of hubris involved here, and by people who are promoting what's basically a Faustian pact with geoengineering. And finally, wouldn't it be more sensible to use I'm not opposed to technology per se. We have technologies. This brings us back to policies here about onshore wind, about the subsidies of North Sea oil, but not of solar and renewable energies in this country. There is an intergenerational aspect here about what kind of planet we leave to future generations. If, as I say, we start and we can't turn the technologies off, they're going to have to live with it. And so we know what to do. That's reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know it can be done. The technology, we know that we can decarbonize the global economy by the middle of the century with the technologies we have now. The cost of renewables is already far lower than coal, for example, around the world. So why isn't it happening? And perhaps the question here is, if the law is limited, if regulating is difficult, does it come down to a matter of politics? Is this about political will? And what will it take to change the politics? What has to happen for countries to do what's necessary? The Paris Agreement is a step in the right direction, but George Monbiot said, I think, a very good line about the Paris Agreement. Compared to what it could have been, it's a miracle. Compared to what it should have been, it's a catastrophe. So, is the response to the catastrophe geoengineering? And that's what I said at the outset. I'm really trying to sort of stimulate debate. In addition to Faye, at least one other person I know read the article from which this comes, because I've been invited to talk about this at the Edinburgh Science Festival in April, which is good because it needs to get sort of out of the academy and into public discourse, because we have to have a participatory democratic discussion about what we should do. So, thanks for listening through that trip through geoengineering.
Well, if you don't have any you haven't been listening. So I would encourage you to please ask Sam some questions. I know I have some, so I will be polite and wait.
It sort of strikes me that the only way around this is to get public opinion on site, and I think the whole social fabric has changed. People are with modern technology, they have a much shorter attention span, and they're much less interested in the sort of scientific background and all the detail, and more in the, if you like, the snapshots and the headlines. And I think what we saw recently with David Attenborough's film on plastics, that that short, very graphic image had such a huge public reaction. It's almost as though you need David Attenborough to make a documentary on the atmosphere and how things are changing. And that's all it. And then public opinion will gradually take over.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that the value of that is that we need climate change. We need to approach climate change from every single possible way. We need stories, we need art, music, literature. The academic stuff and the law is insufficient. And the Attenborough example is that person trusted to that extent with that image has a potentially massive effect. I don't know where and how we could tell the same story about solar radiation management, particularly given the fact that carbon capture and storage is regarded as positive. So you have a good form of climate engineering and a bad form, and will the two get conflated in, the public mind, and to what end?
We have the other issue, which is becoming salient now, and at least I'm reading in newspapers the division between what we might call the less educated classes and the more educated classes, and it doesn't appear to be becoming any less noticeable. And with the prime example of President Trump, and there's no reason to believe that the Trump phenomenon, this phenomenon, won't exist post-Trump. And I'm not. And we've had Mr. Gove, for whatever reason, talking about experts. But there are a number of people who, for whatever reason, don't feel that they want to take part in it, or led by the educated people. And I'm not sure how this can be solved.
I agree. Well, maybe when Brexit kicks in, there will be the revenge of the experts when the true scale of the disaster. I have this nightmare that the damn thing works. The same thing about America at the moment and stuff like that. If the American economy just keeps growing through the next 3 years, there's a really good chance he'll get elected, get re-elected, and it's kind of nightmarish.
We always have the law of unintended consequences, and actually there's the causality doesn't go in a straight line. The fact that there are more jobs in the US isn't necessarily down to Trump. In a sense, the groundwork was laid before, with things that had happened before. And then we also have the cyclical things that happen anyway. I think as regards climate change, I think that there is a role for us who understand the science in terms of actually pushing more the things that we can do from a baseline. I think one of the things that bothers me is not enough is being done to actually get people on side in terms of the things they can do here and now, like using solar power and so on. It's still sort of up in the ether somewhere, and I think that you almost have to live with,
Yeah.
to some extent, the negative things that are happening, the Trumps of this world that are happening, and actually recognize that that is a season, and there is stuff that you have to get on and do. And I personally see, if anybody goes to a place on an annual thing like I do to the Caribbean, a couple of times a year, to the Caribbean, you can see it, it's there.
Yeah.
You know, and people have done stuff,
Yeah.
but even so, it's not enough.
Yeah.
Things like hurricanes
Yeah.
are getting far more frequent
Yeah.
and far more vicious, and you can see where development
Yeah.
is being turned
Yeah.
back by a long, long way. And so I think the time for people have got to, for me, we have got to work in spite of the Trumps of this world and so
Yeah.
on, and you know, drop pebbles in pools wherever we are. And I think I am, because this is about the law thing, I'm really quite interested in where the legal things can be used, because what we're seeing is that you talk about the patents, but it's not only the patents. There are people, for example, I was in New Zealand last spring, and one of the things that's very obvious there are people in the States who are deniers of climate change, but at the same time they're buying up huge swathes of New Zealand because they think that they will be protected in New Zealand.
Survivalists, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
they're buying up
Yeah.
huge swathes
Yeah.
of New Zealand,
Yeah.
and causing really real disruption to all sorts of
Yeah.
aspects of
Yeah.
New Zealand. And so this is the sort of thing for me, trying to use community activism and the law where we can as a disruptive force to do this.
Yeah.
Obviously backed up by the science as we know it, and there's the role. I wish we could get more people in here, and particularly politicians.
Well, you see, the dilemma we have is that states are absolutely central to this, and states are like a problem. So I remember at one of the conference of the parties, I can't remember exactly, I think it was Durban, I can't remember which number that was, about 2-3 years before Paris, and a young woman got up and she said to them, I'm 17 years old or something, you've been negotiating about this since before I was born. And yeah, you know, so if the Paris Agreement had come 20 years ago, we would have maybe a better than even chance. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, states have been very, very bad in dealing with the issue, but they're indispensable because the actions of individual people are meaningful only in terms of state action. So, for example, we saw like the massive change as soon as the 5p charge came in for plastic bags. And, you know, behavioral change and stuff like that. But this is where the law, this is where the regulation and stuff like that. So now actually stopping to sell plastic bags entirely in the supermarkets, because I think Tesco now saying, okay, they're not going to stock plastic bags, but they will provide reusable bags for 15p. So, but that requires some kind of domestic or international action, and then the actions of, if there are public transport options, if there are cycle paths, if there are all those kind of things that require governance and government at local, right up to international level, then individual actions can make a difference. And the other thing in response to what you were saying about, I think the only way we have a chance with this is through activism. The only possible way is from the bottom up, because from the top down it hasn't worked. And thankfully, I mean, most young people now are much more switched onto this issue than previous generations. And hopefully, I mean, again, you know, in relation to what's happening in the United States, in cities and the individual states, there are activities now going on that probably mean that the US will meet the commitments Obama made in the Paris Agreement by bypassing the Trump administration. And that's because it's happening on the ground. So I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, activism is the key to all of this. That's when I raised the question about political will, that's how political will change, hopefully.
Yes, thanks. So I had a point about international environmental law that you mentioned. And as you mentioned, obviously a lot of the principles are still sort of soft law, but I know there has been some literature on the no harm rule and climate and geoengineering. Yeah. Do you see it facing this in terms of if there is ever litigation between two states or something like that? Do you see it facing the same issue? Do you see ever as climate change litigation has, or is geoengineering slightly easier to implement these rules, such as the no harm rule?
Well, for states, I mean, the only place that states could litigate against each other would be in the International Court of Justice.
Yeah.
And that, which requires the states to submit to the court's jurisdiction. And a state who's supporting or facilitating geoengineering is very unlikely to submit to the jurisdiction of the court. And the court is actually, there are debates which I actually need to read a little bit more on, about the pros and cons. There are, I think it's the Marshall Islands, have been calling for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change, akin to the nuclear weapons case, etc. And there are some people who think that this may rebound. It may not be the most positive thing to do. It would require a General Assembly resolution. And I think it's Palau and Marshall Islands. Do you know more about it? Yeah. Do you know what the state of play is in relation to that?
I just know that it's working its way through. So, I mean, my understanding is that what they're trying to do is push for a definitive figure. You know, rather than a judgment, they want a definitive figure regarding temperature rise.
Okay.
And then beyond that,
Yeah.
it's kind of there's a legal, illegal, you know.
Yeah. Well, but we've got the definitive figure in a sense. You know, like that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the biggest scientific peer review exercise in history. You know, with 97% consensus. That's the frustrating thing. The science is absolutely clear. You know, what's less clear is what the implications are of every small incremental increase in temperature, because we've never been here before. But we know what we have to do. We know we can do it. So I'm actually, we were talking earlier on about a friend and colleague, Upendra Bakshi, who I'm actually co-authoring a book on climate justice with at the moment. And all of these issues about rights, about future generations, about, you know, the fallout in the Caribbean and stuff like that and elsewhere. So who owes what to whom? Who is historically most responsible for causing the problems? And so what does the global north owe to the poor and vulnerable in the global south, who are least responsible? But it's also, again, we're talking about lifeboats for the rich. It's an issue even within developed countries. Katrina, Houston, Puerto Rico, you know, and of course, in a place like the United States, it's racialized, because everything is racialized in the United States, because the vulnerable tend to live in areas that are most vulnerable to the impacts of the storms, etc. So I was saying to Faya earlier, I strive to, every time I'm preparing, I teach 2 modules on climate change. Every time I sort of want to slit my throat when I started to prepare. And I have to say, you cannot go into a class and, you know, have students come out of a class thinking there's no hope. But there actually is hope. There are things happening now in terms of divestment. So New York now divesting from fossil fuels, etc. That's massive. That's really, really big. So that's the good side, you know, what I was talking about, the cities and the states. And then I watch...
We might invest in geoengineering.
Well, so we have New York doing that. We have the divestment campaign. It's the biggest, most successful divestment campaign since the, apartheid. And now Aramco are being floated, probably on the London Stock Exchange, and the biggest flotation in history. And I'm looking at it and thinking, you know, the Saudi oil company,
Yes.
trillions for a fossil fuel company. And the irony of it is, I suppose, that Saudi Arabia is trying to diversify its economy away from oil.
Yes,
And again, you just look everywhere. That part of the world, in terms of what's going to happen, that already temperatures are almost unbearable. It's going to get to the point in the Gulf where human beings can't function because the body shuts down. If you can't sweat, if you can't cool yourself down. So construction will be impossible. We've already got this ludicrous crooked World Cup taking place in Qatar with all the migrant workers from South Asia dying, you know, because of the conditions they're working under and stuff like that. As the temperatures go up, I mean, you know, in India about 18 months ago, 50 degrees. And this is, you know, there's no... The other thing is just, we have to stop talking about natural disasters. They're not natural. They're anthropogenic. They're caused by human beings. So, you know, the hurricanes aren't natural. Well, yes, to an extent they are. But the intensity and the frequency is now anthropogenic. So, yeah, we just have to keep on keeping on. I know it sounds trite. We have to. We have to. So far as I'm concerned, it's a kind of division of labour. So that from an academic and intellectual perspective, I can try to provide ideas that, so for example, the Global Network on Human Rights and the Environment, we've now teamed up with Greenpeace, so to try and provide academic input into the climate litigation that they're undertaking. We've got a workshop on climate litigation at Warwick on the 14th of February, in which we're actually looking at, so there again, in terms of positive things sort of happening, where there's now, I think we've reached a threshold where there's going to be tons and tons of climate litigation. There's a law firm in London trying to get a judicial review of the government's policies here under the Climate Change Act. Places all over, South Africa, Pakistan, you name it, and people are now resorting to the law. And there, again, there are real problems with the law because, well, two. One is standing. Who has the right to bring a case? South Asia is quite good because of public interest litigation, where anybody can bring a case. They don't have to have a direct relationship to the harms that are caused. The other is causation, because in trying to make governments or energy companies responsible, since greenhouse gases don't obey borders, how do you prove that the emissions of the United States or the UK were responsible for the harms that are taking place in the Caribbean or somewhere else in the Pacific? So again, I sort of come back to, we have to use every single lever we've got, but to me, the political ultimately, you know, and with the litigation, we're going to have to pull every lever as many times until we sort of get it comes up jackpot, and if we get one big case against energy companies, that might open the floodgates. But we just have to keep on doing this again and again and again. So that's why I think there's a division of labour between the NGOs, the environmental NGOs, between students, lawyers, academics, everybody contributing to the extent that it's possible. And as I said, from every perspective, the media, artists, musicians, everybody, the more stories we can tell, because, you know, and the picture speaking 1,000 words, coming back to David Attenborough and stuff like that, but also in terms of climate justice, trying to get to a point where a lot of the things with charity is to try and humanize the effects. So in terms of the violation of human rights, etc., if we can show how this is affecting human beings, the trouble with the charities is charity fatigue. And, you know, if we can show how people are losing livelihoods because of climate change, or people are dying, will it spur more action? And we just have to keep on keeping on, because morally we can't not. We have to do everything we can to try and achieve justice for current and future generations. I've got my son and my daughter-in-law, who's actually originally from the Caribbean, are seriously talking about whether they want to have children because of a thing like climate change. And that's like, yeah, so thinking about what kind of world their children would grow up in. And that's why I raised the issue about blue skies and orange and polar bears and stuff like that. And what...
Well, speaking as a grandmother, I think they should go ahead. I think, I always say, you know, we're survivors in one form or another. And if you think about the history of the Caribbean, you know, we have a lot of life left in this thing. And just one thing that is always worth remembering, that actually sometimes we can use existing laws for, you know, to get to where we want to get to. I'm not suggesting it's easy in any way, but I speak as someone who I remember using the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health legislation to deal with the tobacco issue, pollution from tobacco in indoor environments. So it can be interesting when you use something that was actually meant about something else, but actually turned out to be very useful in another.
And in terms of litigation and attribution for climate change,
Yes.
Asbestos is one.
Yeah.
You know, it's like multiple businesses that an individual worked for. You know, you can attribute reasonably, you know, a proportion of the causation to, and the science around attribution on climate change is getting really sophisticated.
It is,
and that's obviously going to feed into the possibility of holding to account businesses particularly.
Absolutely.
Well, this is, you know, in my research and teaching, I'm sort of looking at the potential and the limits of the law. So here is a question in terms of regulation about how effective would law be here. Could we actually do it through law if we wanted to do it? Another one, just in relation to the Caribbean, is in terms of migration. So you're going to have millions of people displaced by climate change, by the impacts of climate change, and who are, most of them will be internally displaced. And when the migration happens, it's most likely to be to neighboring states, but they're going to migrate with absolutely no protection under international law. And so you start to say, okay, could we envisage a dedicated treaty, a protocol to the 1951 Refugee Convention, under which I came to this country, purely political test, no climate. Lawyers are now looking at whether the well-founded fear of persecution, whether climate change could constitute a form of persecution. So again, imagine I've got the three I's I talk about in terms of lawyers. We need to be innovative, imaginative, and insurgent. We need to try One of the liberating things about this is that we're almost obliged to sort of go into, to engage in thinking that might be regarded as bizarre, bonkers, or off the wall, but you just have to try and think about it. So in terms of migration, for example, in the current climate, I cannot foresee Europe, United States, doing a dedicated treaty for the protection of climate displaced people. I can't see a protocol, another protocol to the 1951 Refugee Convention. I can't see a protocol to the Framework Convention, etc. So we end up here, we've got this legal loophole, or this lacuna, where people are going to be moving without protection under the law. So now we're starting already. Kiribati, I think it is, has bought land in Fiji. We're getting all sorts of novel problems that start to turn up about whether it's possible to have permanent governments in exile. So as the small island states start disappearing, and I'll come back to this, it's relevant to the Caribbean, could they have governments in exile in another country? Which country would that be? Would they have to buy land? Now, so part of the arguments are to say that people in the Pacific, the obvious places for them to go would be Australia and New Zealand, because those are two developed countries who have historically emitted, especially Australia, quite a very bad record on greenhouse gas emissions and stuff like that, and because there are already diaspora communities there. So you think, okay, that's kind of logical, but you'd have to try and convince a country like Australia, whose immigration policies are horrific. I mean, there are people self-harming and committing suicide in Nauru and Fiji and stuff like that. Would they agree to that? What do you do? So you're thinking diaspora communities, things in common. Where do the people from the Maldives go? A predominantly Muslim country. To Sri Lanka, which is Tamil and Sinhalese. To Hindu fundamentalist India. To Bangladesh, which is a Muslim country, but is going to be already one of the biggest sufferers from sea level rise. Now, with the Caribbean, the obvious diaspora community is, and in terms of climate justice, I saw this figure that from something like 1800 to about 2010, 2 countries were responsible for half of all greenhouse gas emissions, or carbon dioxide. The US and the UK. 2 countries responsible for half. So when you talk about historical responsibility, ability to pay the benefits that have been accrued from the use of fossil fuels, the UK qualifies on all of those grounds. There is the links, as I say, the diaspora communities, the cultural links between people here and people in the Caribbean. Can you see any future British government? Because the small island states in the Caribbean are going to be threatened. Not all of the islands, not all of the time, but as the sea levels rise and people are forced to shift away from the coast, come into conflict, etc., we really have to, my fear is, we end up dealing with all of this on an ad hoc, case-by-case humanitarian basis, which is what we do with natural disasters. We put out the begging bowl to countries. The UN agencies do that all the time. We need to think ahead. We need to do this in a more rational way, because we're talking about millions of people. And again, the law is just bad here.
I mean, I think when you were listing the reasons why the UK and the US should take people, you say the ability to pay. Now, every Joe on the street, if you said the UK has the ability to pay today, they would go, no, we don't. We can't even run our health service. We're going to get rid of the Overseas Development Fund. That's why we're leaving the EU. Look, so in the mindset of your average soul, no way do we have the ability to pay it. And I think this is where, what's been interesting about your talk for me has been really the international relations dimension, right? So when you talk about who we is that could control this, I would say more the geoengineering in terms of solar radiation management. It is being funded, and I would imagine the research is primarily funded by certain groups as well. We've got interest,
Yep.
vested interest, but it's a north-south issue,
Yep.
and that's racialised. A lot of people don't care about people, you know,
Yep.
the population boom,
Yep.
that still goes in people's minds.
Yep.
And all of this kind of is within the ways in which people respond to the imageries as well. I mean, the gentleman's left now, but, you know, David Attenborough has gone on about climate change for many years, right? The plastics, it's tangible, it's visible, and the message was through a turtle, you know, and we like, you know, people respond to turtles. People don't respond to large numbers of people being displaced in conflict areas from different religious groups, cultures we don't understand, don't like. I mean, I don't think we engage enough with that from a legal dimension. So we're trying to resolve these things in legal ways without recognising the sort of political economy and the international relations dimensions as well.
Well, I was about to, you're quite right, of course, and I was sitting here thinking that actually another legal thing here is, of course, the reparations movement, because a lot of the people in the Caribbean could say quite frankly, well, hello there, you know, a lot of the Industrial Revolution and in fact, when I go into the cities, I'm always recognizing the marble halls as being where those come from, and West India Docks and so on. So people, that is also a dialogue that needs to happen, that people need to understand that there were times actually when there were problems in this country and people went to the rest of the world, and as a result this country benefited. And so that's something that's very often not really spelled out, and I think there's more of that needs to happen as well. But I think I'm probably much older than most people here, and I am actually probably a little bit more optimistic. I think one of the problems we have is people have short memories. They forget that actually, you know, there have been times, as I said before, when people needed help, and I can think of the wars and so on, when other people came and helped this Europe and England. And I think that people need to go back to that. I think that the youngsters coming up will find solutions. I've seen lots of changes that have happened, and so I don't have pink spectacles on. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we will find ways of having a dialogue, and finding solutions to this one. And as you said, everybody, wherever you are, if you drop this thing in the pool.
Well, I don't want to, I think we should bring it to an end. I just, a couple of comments. One, I don't want to criticize the saintly David Attenborough too much, but he was very poor on climate change for a long, long time. He had the opportunity, and only recently, and in quite a gentle way, he's, you know, he could have done this a long time ago. He could have advanced the debate quite a lot. The other thing is about the reparations. I think that it's an issue I think very much in terms of climate justice. We need to talk about reparations. And
big subject.
Well, when Cameron went to Jamaica, about 2014 or something, at the time there were calls in Jamaica for reparations for colonialism.
Oh, yes.
And what he gave Jamaica was a prison. The British government offered, in terms of aid, to build a prison, and I thought how utterly symbolic that actually is. Like, absolutely the right thing. What we will give you as a form of reparations is a prison.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was the end of Portia.
Yeah.
She was
Yeah,
replaced
that's right.
following that,
Yeah.
because that was insulting.
Okay. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.